Part of the problem with talking about where to go from here is that the United States cannot fix its own problems in isolation, since it's deeply connected with the rest of the world, both militarily and economically. Part of the unsustainability of the system that crashed in 2008 came from this interpenetration between the economies of the United States and those of Europe and Asia. In my book, Land of Promise, I argue that the system could be called the Pax Americana system that arose after World War II, in which, in the context of the Cold War, the United States created the so-called Free World Alliance, which included a lot of authoritarian states in the Middle East and in Latin America that were anything but free, free in the sense of being non-communist, in which there was essentially a bargain between the United States and the two most powerful industrial countries outside of the US. And these were the defeated Axis powers of Germany, then the western half of Germany, West Germany, and Japan. Rather than rehabilitate Germany and Japan as three-dimensional, full-fledged great powers with their own separate foreign policies, which was considered too dangerous, the United States encouraged them to be demilitarized or less militarized than the United States and its allies Britain and France, and at the same time to specialize in industrial production. And that industrial production, coming from the two most important industrial capitalist countries of East Asia and Europe, Japan and Germany, had to go somewhere. It couldn't go to communist China. But after Mao's revolution, the Japanese had lost their Chinese markets, and it couldn't go to Eastern Europe and to Russia, which had been traditionally large markets for Germany for its exports. So Germany and Japan in the 1950s and 1960s specialized in being geopolitical midgets and industrial giants. I say this is a policy of making cars, not wars. So rather than making Panzers and Zeros, they made Toyotas and Volkswagens, and they targeted the US market, the world's largest and most prosperous. This worked initially when they were recovering from the devastation of World War II. By the 1970s, it was beginning to really affect American manufacturing. And you were also beginning to see overcapacity in industry, because if you have two of the three largest industrial countries focusing on exporting rather than consuming a lot of the goods they export, this is going to lead over time to overcapacity, misallocation of resources, and various imbalances in the global economy. Rather than reconsider this, the United States doubled down with the liberalization of China after the downfall of Mao and the rise of Deng Xiaoping. So the United States in the 1980s and 1990s essentially offered post-Maoist China the same deal that it had offered post-Hitler Germany and post-Tojo Japan. As you allow us to protect your neighborhood, we will be the local military power in East Asia, in Central Asia, just as we've been in Western Europe and the Pacific during the Cold War. We will protect your oil supplies, which are much more important for the industrial countries of Western Europe and of East Asia, including China, than they are for the United States. We get most of our oil not from ourselves, but also from Canada and Mexico, much more than we get from the Persian Gulf. So we're essentially protecting the oil of our subordinate allies as the global military political hegemon. We're not protecting American oil as such. We're protecting America's status in the world as the provider of free security. In the United States, the deal that it offered all the industrial countries, both the older ones of Western Europe and Japan, but also the new emerging ones like China and India, was we will offer a couple of public goods. The public good of free universal military protection. We will run much larger defense budgets than you do, but you don't need to, because we will police your sea lanes. We will make sure that the oil from the Persian Gulf arrives in your ports. We will do all of this for you. We don't want you to rearm. We remember what happened the last time you guys were independent military powers. So we would rather have you as military satellites of ours. So we will offer you the good of free public security. We will offer you the good of the dollar as the world's reserve currency, which makes trade easier if there's a single common currency that's used in international transactions. And last but not least, we will act as the banker of last resort. So when countries in Europe or Latin America or elsewhere threaten to go under, or East Asia, the United States, either on its own or with its allies, will cobble together some financial rescue package to bail out your country so that you don't go under. And all of this is done in the context of this Pax Americana system, which is not what is portrayed as this equal concert of nations, all with equal juridical rights. That's true on paper. But it's actually a hierarchical system in which the United States specializes in military security and finance, and it allows the next tier of countries, the largest industrial states, the three largest of which are China, Japan, and Germany, first West Germany, now reunited Federal Republic of Germany, they will specialize in industrial production. Inevitably, this system was doomed to crash because the Chinese, Germans, and Japanese produced too much for the consumers of the world to accommodate, not only their own consumers, but those in the United States. The American consumer kept this Pax Americana system going for a couple of decades by maxing out on credit cards because their wages had not been keeping up. But as soon as the American consumer stopped consuming, then the question arose, well, if the other three major industrial powers on the planet want to run perpetual merchandise trade exports, surpluses of goods that their own people don't consume, where are the markets for this? There was a theory in the early 2000s of decoupling. A lot of otherwise intelligent people said, we don't need the American consumer anymore. The rising middle classes in China, in India, in Latin America, they will take up the slack. So even if American consumers become less important, then these export-oriented countries can continue to just crank out the industrial goods and sell them to different customers. Interesting theory, it seemed plausible at the time. Along comes the crisis of 2008. The American consumers suddenly stop spending money. The entire global system comes grinding to a halt because whatever may be the case with the global middle class in the year 2030 or the year 2080 or 2100, in 2008, it simply was not big enough to replace the American consumer as the consumer of first resort for the entire world. And you have to look at this global pattern. It is missed in most of our discussion. We tend to talk about bilateral relations, U.S.-Europe, U.S.-Japan, U.S.-China. The Asian Development Bank had a very important report a few years ago showing that most of the components of the iPhone, which was then manufactured in China, were not actually made in China itself. They weren't made in the United States either. Some of them were. The countries that contributed the most in terms of the actual components of the iPhone were Germany, Japan, and South Korea. They made the high-tech components, which were then shipped to China, assembled in China, and shipped to the United States. So what that means is the enormous and continuing Chinese trade surpluses with the U.S. are not just Chinese trade surpluses. They're Chinese, German, Japanese, South Korean trade surpluses.